Hello. This is John T. Rhapsodes, Esquire, purveyor of awesome old-school audio stories. I bring you today a funny one from 1909 by O. Henry, called The Hiding of Black Bill. William Sidney Porter, writing under the pen name O. Henry, walked the earth from 1862 to 1910. Mostly in Texas and New York. If you like awesome old-school audio stories from old minds that were once young minds, brought to you free of charge and with a grateful heart, consider while listening to subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications to get notice of new stories. Some funny, some spooky, others somewhere in between, and all awesome. Usually at least once a week. These simple acts will help this channel immensely. And now, hear the words of old. The Hiding of Black Bill, from 1909 by O. Henry. A lank, strong, red-faced man with a Wellington beak and small, fiery eyes tempered by flaxen lashes, sat on the station platform at Los Pinos, swinging his legs to and fro. At his side sat another man, fat, melancholy, and seedy, who seemed to be his friend. They had the appearance of men to whom life had appeared as a reversible coat. See me on both sides. "Ain't seen you in about 4 years, Ham," said the seedy man. "Which way you been traveling?" "Texas," said the red-faced man. "It was too cold in Alaska for me, and I found it warm in Texas. I'll tell you about one hot spell I went through there. One morning I steps off the international train at a water tank and lets it go on without me. 'Twas a ranch country and fuller of spite houses than New York City. Only out there they build 'em 20 miles away so you can't smell what they've got for dinner instead of running 'em up 2 inches from their neighbors' windows. There wasn't any roads in sight, so I footed it cross country. The grass was shoe-top deep, and the mesquite timber looked just like a peach orchard. It was so much like a gentleman's private estate that every minute you expected a kennel full of bulldogs to run out and bite you. But I must have walked 20 miles before I came in sight of a ranch house. It was a little one, about as big as an elevated railroad station. There was a little man in a white shirt and brown overalls and a pink handkerchief around his neck, rolling cigarettes under a tree in front of the door. "Greetings," says I. "Any refreshment, welcome, emoluments, or even work for a comparative stranger?" "Oh, come in," says he, in a refined tone. "Sit down on that stool, please. I didn't hear your horse coming." "He isn't near enough yet," says I. "I walked. I don't want to be a burden, but I wonder if you have 3 or 4 gallons of water handy." "You do look pretty dusty," says he. "But our bathing arrangements—" "It's a drink I want," says I. "Never mind the dust that's on the outside." He gets me a dipper of water out of a red jar hanging up, and then goes on. "Do you want work?" "For a time," says I. "This is a rather quiet section of the country, isn't it?" "It is," says he. "Sometimes, so I've been told, one sees no human being pass for weeks at a time. I've been here only a month. I bought the ranch from an old settler who wanted to move farther west." "It suits me," says I. Quiet and retirement are good for a man sometimes. And I need a job. I can tend bar, salt mines, lecture, float stock, do a little middleweight slugging, and play the piano." "Can you herd sheep?" asked the little ranchman. "Do you mean have I heard sheep?" says I. "Can you herd them? Take charge of a flock of 'em," says the man. "Oh," says I, "now I understand. You mean chase 'em around and bark at 'em like collie dogs." "Well, I might," says I. "I've never exactly done any sheep herding, but I've often seen 'em from train car windows masticating daisies, and they don't look dangerous." "I'm short a herder," says the ranchman. "I've only got 2 flocks. You may take out my bunch of muttons. There are only 800 of 'em, in the morning, if you like. The pay is $12 a month, and your rations furnished. You camp in a tent on the prairie with your sheep. You do your own cooking, but wood and water are brought to your camp. It's an easy job." "I'm on it," says I. "I'll take the job even if I have to garland my brow and hold on to a crook and wear a loose effect and play on a pipe like the shepherds do in the pictures." So the next morning the little ranchman helps me drive the flock of muttons from the corral to about 2 miles out and let 'em graze on a little hillside on the prairie. He gives me a lot of instructions about not letting bunches of 'em stray off from the herd and driving 'em down to a water hole to drink at noon. "I'll bring out your tent and camping outfit and rations in the buckboard before night," says he. "Fine," says I. "And don't forget the rations, nor the camping outfit. And be sure to bring the tent. Your name's Zollicoffer, ain't it?" "My name," says he, "is Henry Ogden." "All right, Mr. Ogden," says I. "Mine is Mr. Percival St. Clair." I herded sheep for 5 days on the Rancho Chiquito, and then the wool entered my soul. That getting next to nature certainly got next to me. I was lonesomer than Crusoe's goat. I've seen a lot of persons more entertaining as companions than those sheep were. I'd drive 'em to the corral and pen 'em every evening, and then cook my cornbread and mutton and coffee, and lie down in a tent the size of a tablecloth and listen to the coyotes and whippoorwills singing around the camp. The 5th evening, after I had corralled my costly but uncongenial sheep, I walked over to the ranch house and stepped in the door. "Mr. Ogden," says I, "you and me have got to get sociable. Sheep are all very well to dot the landscape and furnish $8 cotton suitings for man, but for table talk and fireside companions, they rank along with 5 o'clock teasers. If you've got a deck of cards or a Parcheesi outfit or a game of authors, well, get 'em out and let's get on a mental basis. I've got to do something in an intellectual line, if it's only to knock somebody's brains out." This Henry Ogden was a peculiar kind of ranchman. He wore finger rings and a big gold watch and careful neckties. And his face was calm, and his nose spectacles were kept very shiny. I saw once in Muskogee an outlaw hung for murdering 6 men who was a dead ringer for him. But I knew a preacher in Arkansas that you would have taken to be his brother. I didn't care much for him either way. What I wanted was some fellowship and communion with holy saints or lost sinners. Anything sheepless would do. Well, St. Clair, says he, laying down the book he was reading, I guess it must be pretty lonesome for you at first, and I don't deny that it's monotonous for me. Are you sure you corralled your sheep so they won't stray out? They're shut up as tight as the jury of a millionaire murderer, says I, and I'll be back with 'em long before they'll need their trained nurse. So Ogden digs up a deck of cards and we play casino. After 5 days and nights of sheep camp, it was like an adventure on Broadway. When I won a hand, I felt as excited as if I had made $1 million. And when H.O. loosened up a little and told the story about the lady in the Pullman car, I laughed for 5 minutes. And that showed what a comparative thing life is. A man may see so much that he'd be bored to turn his head to look at a $3 million fire, or Joe Weber, or the Adriatic Sea. But let him herd sheep for a spell, and you'll see him splitting his ribs laughing at "Curfew Shall Not Ring Tonight," or really enjoying himself playing cards with ladies. By and by, Ogden gets out a decanter of bourbon, and then there is a total eclipse of sheep. Do you remember reading in the papers about a month ago, says Ogden, about a train holdup on the MK&T? The express agent was shot through the shoulder, and about $15,000 in currency taken, and it's said that only one man did the job. Seems to me I do, says I. But such things happen so often, they don't linger long in the human Texas mind. Did they overtake, overhaul, seize, or lay hands upon the despoiler? He escaped, says Ogden. And I was just reading in a paper today that the officers have tracked him down into this part of the country. It seems the bills the robber got were all the first issue of currency to the Second National Bank of Espinosa City. And so they've followed the trail where they've been spent, and it leads this way. Ogden pours out some more bourbon and shoves me the bottle. I imagine, says I, after ingurgitating another modicum of the royal booze, that it wouldn't be at all a disingenuous idea for a train robber to run down into this part of the country to hide for a spell. A sheep ranch now, says I, would be the finest kind of a place. Who'd ever expect to find such a desperate character among these songbirds and muttons and wild flowers? And by the way, says I, kind of looking H. Ogden over, was there any description mentioned of this single-handed terror? Was his lineaments, or height and thickness, or teeth fillings, or style of habiliment set forth in print? Why, no, says Ogden. They say nobody got a good sight of him because he wore a mask. But they know it was a train robber called Black Bill, because he always works alone, and because he dropped a handkerchief in the express car that had his name on it. All right, says I approve of Black Bill's retreat to the sheep ranges. I guess they won't find him. There's $1,000 reward for his capture, says Ogden. I don't need that kind of money, says I, looking Mr. Sheepman straight in the eye. The $12 a month you pay me is enough. I need a rest, and I can save up until I get enough to pay my fare to Texarkana, where my widowed mother lives. If Black Bill, I goes on, looking significantly at Ogden, was to have come down this way, say a month ago, and bought a little sheep ranch and— Stop, says Ogden, getting out of his chair and looking pretty vicious. Do you mean to insinuate? Nothing, says I. No insinuations. I'm stating a hypodermical case. I say if Black Bill had come down here and bought a sheep ranch and hired me to Little Boy Blue 'em and treated me square and friendly, as you've done, he'd never have anything to fear from me. A man is a man, regardless of any complications he may have with sheep or railroad trains. Now you know where I stand." Ogden looks black as camp coffee for 9 seconds, and then he laughs, amused. "You'll do just fine, St. Clair," says he. "If I was Black Bill, I wouldn't be afraid to trust you. Let's have a game or two of 7-Up tonight. That is, if you don't mind playing with a train robber." "I've told you my oral sentiments," says I, "and there's no strings to 'em." While I was shuffling after the first hand, I asked Ogden, as if the idea was a kind of casualty, where he was from. "Oh," says he, "from the Mississippi Valley." "That's a nice little place," says I. "I've often stopped over there. But didn't you find the sheets a little damp and the food poor? I was last at the Pacific Slope. Ever put up there?" "Too draughty," said Ogden. "But if you're ever in the Middle West, just mention my name, and you'll get foot warmers and dripped coffee." "Well," says I wasn't exactly fishing for your private telephone number and the middle name of your aunt that carried off the Cumberland Presbyterian minister. It don't matter. I just want you to know you are safe in the hands of your shepherd. Now, don't play hearts on spades, and don't get nervous." "Ha ha! Still harping," said Ogden, laughing again. "Don't you suppose that if I was Black Bill, and thought you suspected me, I'd put a Winchester bullet into you and stop my nervousness, if I had any?" "Not any," says I. "A man who's got the nerve to hold up a train single-handed wouldn't do a trick like that. I've knocked about enough to know that them are the kind of men who put a value on a friend. Not that I can claim being a friend of yours, Mr. Ogden," says I, "being only your sheep herder, but under more expeditious circumstances we might have been." "Forget the sheep temporarily, I beg," says Ogden, "and cut for deal." About 4 days afterward, while my sheep was nooning on the water hole and I deep in the interstices of making a pot of coffee, up rides softly on the grass a mysterious person in the garb of the being he wished to represent. He was dressed somewhere between a Kansas City detective, Buffalo Bill, and the town dog catcher of Baton Rouge. His chin and eye wasn't molded on fighting lines, so I knew he was only a scout. "Herdin' sheep?" he asked me. "Well," says I, "to a man of your evident gumptional endowments, I wouldn't have the nerve to state that I am engaged in decorating old bronzes or oiling bicycle sprockets." "You don't talk or look like a sheep herder to me," says he. "But you talk like what you look like to me," says I. And then he asked me who I was working for, and I shows him Rancho Chiquito 2 miles away in the shadow of a low hill, and he tells me he's a deputy sheriff. "There's a train robber called Black Bill who's supposed to be somewhere in these parts," says the scout. "He's been traced as far as San Antonio, and maybe farther. Have you seen or heard of any strangers around here during the last month?" "I have not," says I, "except a report of one over at the Mexican quarters of Loomis's ranch on the Frio." "What do you know about him?" asked the deputy. "He's 3 days old," says I. "What kind of a looking man is the man you work for?" he asks. "Does old George Ramey still own this place? He's run sheep here for the last 10 years, but never had no success." "The old man has sold out and gone west," I tells him. "Another sheep fancier bought him out about a month ago." "What kind of a looking man is he?" asked the deputy again. "Oh," says I, "a big fat kind of Dutchman, with long whiskers and blue specks. I don't think he knows a sheep from a ground squirrel. I guess old George soaked him pretty good on that deal," says I. After indulging himself in a lot more non-communicative information and 2/3 of my dinner, the deputy rode away. That night I mentions the matter to Ogden. "They're drawing the tendrils of the octopus around Black Bill," says I. And then I told him about the deputy sheriff and how I described him to the deputy and what the deputy said about the matter. "Oh well," says Ogden, "let's don't borrow any of Black Bill's troubles. We've a few of our own. Get the bourbon out of the cupboard and we'll drink to his health. Unless," says he with his little cackling laugh, "you're prejudiced against train robbers." "I'll drink," says I, "to any man who's a friend to a friend. And I believe that Black Bill," I goes on, "would be that. So here's to Black Bill, and may he have good luck." And both of us drank. About 2 weeks later come shearing time. The sheep had to be driven up to the ranch, and a lot of frowsy-headed helpers would snip the fur off of 'em with back-action scissors. So the afternoon before the barbers were to come, I hustled my underdone muttons over the hill, across the dell down by the winding brook, and up to the ranch house, where I pinned 'em in a corral and bade 'em my nightly adieus. I went from there to the ranch house. I find H. Ogden, Esquire, lying asleep on his little cot bed. I guess he had been overcome by anti-insomnia or diswakefulness or some of the diseases peculiar to the sheep business. His mouth and vest were open, and he breathed like a second-hand bicycle pump. I looked at him and gave vent to just a few musings. "Imperial Caesar," says I, "asleep in such a way, might shut his mouth and keep the wind away." A man asleep is certainly a sight to make angels weep. What good is all his brain, muscle, backing, nerve, influence, and family connections? He's at the mercy of his enemies, and more so of his friends. And he's about as beautiful as a cab horse leaning against the Metropolitan Opera House at 12:30 a.m., dreaming of the plains of Arabia. Now a woman asleep you regard as different. No matter how she looks, you know it's better for all hands for her to be that way. Well, I took a drink of bourbon and one for Ogden, and started in to be comfortable while he was taking his nap. He had some books on his table on indigenous subjects, such as Japan and drainage and physical culture, and some tobacco, which seemed more to the point. After I'd smoked a few, and listened to the sartorial breathing of H.O., I happened to look out the window toward the shearing pens, where there was a kind of a road coming up from a kind of a road across a kind of a creek farther away. I saw 5 men riding up to the house. All of 'em carried guns across their saddles, and among 'em was the deputy that had talked to me at my camp. They rode up careful in open formation, with their guns ready. I set apart with my eye the one I opinionated to be the boss muckraker of this law and order cavalry. "Good evening, gents," says I. "Won't you light and tie your horses?" The boss rides up close and swings his gun over till the opening in it seems to cover my whole front elevation. "Don't you move your hands none," says he, "till you and me indulge in an adequate amount of necessary conversation." "Oh, I won't," says I. "I'm no deaf-mute, and therefore will not have to disobey your injunctions in replying." "We are on the lookout," says he, "for Black Bill, the man that held up the Katy for $15,000 in May. We are searching the ranches and everybody on 'em. What is your name, and what do you do on this ranch?" "Captain," says I, "Percival St. Clair is my occupation, and my name is sheepherder. I've got my flock of muttons, penned here tonight. The shears are coming tomorrow to give 'em a haircut with rum, I suppose." "Where's the boss of this ranch?" the captain of the gang asked me. "Now wait just a minute, Captain," says I. "Wasn't there a kind of reward offered for the capture of this desperate character you have referred to in your preamble?" "There is $1,000 reward offered," said the captain. "But it's for the capture and conviction. There don't seem to be no provision made for an informer." "Well, it looks like it might rain in a day or so," says I, in a tired way, looking up at the cerulean blue sky. "If you know anything about the locality, disposition, or secretiveness of this here Black Bill," says the captain in a severe dialect, "you are amiable to the law in not reporting it." "I heard a fence rider say," says I, in a desultory kind of voice, "that a Mexican told a cowboy named Jake, over at Pidgin's store on the Nueces, that he heard that Black Bill had been seen in Matamoros by a sheepman's cousin 2 weeks ago." "Tell you what I'll do, tight mouth," says the captain, after looking me over for bargains. "If you put us on so we can scoop Black Bill, I'll pay you $100 out of our own pockets." "That's liberal," says the captain. "Now, what do you say?" "Cash down now?" I asks. The captain has a sort of discussion with his helpmates, and they all produce the contents of their pockets for analysis. Out of the general results, they figured up $102.30 in cash and $31 worth of plug tobacco. "Come nearer, Captain Mio," says I, "and listen." He so did. "I am mighty poor and low down in the world," says I. "I'm working for $12 a month trying to keep a lot of animals together whose only thought seems to be get asunder. Although," says I regard myself as some better than the state of South Dakota. It's a come down to a man who has heretofore regarded sheep only in the form of chops. I'm pretty far reduced in the world on account of foiled ambitions and rum and a kind of cocktail they make along the PRR all the way from Scranton to Cincinnati. Dry gin, French vermouth, 1 squeeze of a lime, and a good dash of orange bitters. If you're ever up that way, don't fail to let one try you. And again," says I have never yet went back on a friend. I've stayed by 'em when they had plenty, and when adversity's overtaken me, I've never forsook 'em. But," I goes on, "this is not exactly the case of a friend. $12 a month is only bowing acquaintance money. And I do not consider brown beans and cornbread the food of friendship. I am a poor man, says I, and I have a widowed mother in Texarkana. You will find Black Bill, says I, lying asleep in this here house on a cot in the room to your right. He's the man you want, as I know from his words and conversation. He was in a way a friend, I explains, and if I was the man I once was, the entire product of the mines of Gondola would not have tempted me to betray him. But, says I, every week half of the beans was wormy, and not nigh enough wood in camp. Better go in careful, gentlemen, says I. He seems impatient at times, and when you think of his late professional pursuits, one would look for abrupt actions if he was come upon sudden. So the whole posse unmounts and ties their horses and unlimbers their ammunition and equipments and tiptoes into the house. And I follows, like Delilah when she set the Philip Steins on the Samson. The leader of the posse shakes Ogden and wakes him up. And then he jumps up and two more of the reward hunters grab him. Ogden was mighty tough with all his slimness, and he gives them as neat a single-footed tussle against odds as I ever seen. What is the meaning of this? Ogden says, after they had him down. You're scooped in, Mr. Black Bill, says the captain. That's all. It's an outrage, says Ogden. Matter yet. It was an outrage, says the captain. The Katy wasn't bothering you, and there's a law against monkeying with express packages. And the captain sits on H. Ogden and goes through his pockets symptomatically and careful. I'll make you perspire for this, says Ogden, perspiring some himself. I can prove who I am. So can I, says the captain, as he draws from H. Ogden's inside coat pocket a handful of new bills of the Second National Bank of Espinosa City. Your regular engraved Tuesdays and Fridays visiting card wouldn't have a louder voice in proclaiming your indemnity than this here currency. You can get up now and prepare to go with us and expatriate your sins. H. Ogden gets up and fixes his necktie. He says no more after they have taken the money off him. A well-greased idea, says the sheriff captain, admiring. To slip off down here and buy a little sheep ranch where the hand of man is seldom heard. It was the slickest hideout I ever did see, says the captain. And so, one of the men goes to the shearing pen and hunts up the other herder, a Mexican they called John Sally's, and he saddles Ogden's horse, and the sheriffs all ride up close around him with their guns in hand, ready to take their prisoner to town. Before starting, Ogden puts the ranch in John Sally's hands and gives him orders about the shearing and where to graze the sheep, just as if he intended to be back in a few days. And a couple of hours afterward, one Percival St. Clair, an ex-sheepherder of the Rancho Chiquito, might have been seen with $109 wages and blood money in his pocket, riding south on another horse belonging to said ranch. The red-faced man paused and listened. The whistle of a coming freight train sounded far away among the low hills. The fat, seedy man at his side sniffed and shook his frowsy head slowly and disparagingly. "What is it, Snippy?" asked the other. "Got the blues again?" "No, I ain't," said the seedy one, sniffing again. "But I don't like your talk." You and me have been friends off and on for 15 years, and I never yet knew or heard of you giving anybody up to the law, not no one. And here was a man whose saleratus you had et, and at whose table you had played games of cards, if casino can be so called. And yet you inform him to the law and take money for it. It never was like you, I say. This H. Ogden, resumed the red-faced man, through a lawyer, proved himself free by alibis and other legal terminalities, as I so heard afterward. He never suffered no harm. He did me favors, and I hated to hand them over. How about the bills they found in his pocket? Asked the seedy man. I put 'em there while he was asleep, when I saw the posse riding up, said the red-faced man. I was Black Bill. Look out now, Snippy. Here comes the train. We'll board her on the bumpers when she takes water at the tank. And that concludes O. Henry's 1909 story called The Hiding of Black Bill. This is John T. Rhapsodes, Esquire, purveyor of awesome old-school audio stories. Thank you for listening. You can hear more stories like this in the channel's playlists. Find them by staying tuned for the last 20 seconds of this video and clicking on the end-screen icons. You can also go to the channel homepage and click on the playlist tab. If you enjoyed this story and would like to hear more, please download the YouTube app, create an account, subscribe to this channel, like this video by clicking on the thumbs up icon, leave your thoughts in the comments section, click the notification bell, and share the videos with your friends so that they too can hear the words of old.